It does lose contrast in the sunlight, but you know what? That's true of pretty much all vintage lenses and many modern ones as well. There are very few lenses that can do battle with that mighty star and come out the winner. Well, hey everybody, and thank you for checking in once again, and welcome to another episode. Well, now I've been shooting a number of wide angle lenses recently, like this little Meyer Optik Görlitz Lidith that I've got here, and that's quite an unusual thing for me. I usually like to shoot longer focal lengths, certainly 50 millimeters, but usually more than 50 mil, around about 75, 80, 90, 100. I do like the longer reach that a longer focal length will give me, but nevertheless I have unusually been shooting some wides, and I've really been appreciating the way that it opens up a real sort of panorama, a panoramic view that feels full of light and air and space, and I've been trying to use those larger spaces and subjects more effectively. Now, these lenses are great for various things. They're great for architecture shots, they're great for street photography, they're great for landscape photography, and they're good for general photography as well. Also, some of them go quite close. In fact, quite a few of them do. Some of them go down to 20 centimeters or so. So they're also quite good for close-ups. And this is not the first type of lens I would think for making a close-up with, but nevertheless you can make some pretty nice close-ups with many of these lenses. They're not macro lenses by any means, but they will go fairly close, and I've made some quite interesting close shots with them. So that's a little bonus that these lenses can offer. They're not natural blur monsters. The wider a field of view in a lens is, the less inherent background blur it will have. So these are not natural blur monsters, but you can make some blur with them. Some of these have fairly fast apertures. One or two of them go up to f2. So those lenses, the faster an aperture is, the wider an aperture opening is, then the more background blur that will give you. Also, as I said, some of these lenses will go pretty close to the subject. Some of them will go down to 20 centimeters or so. So shooting at the minimum focus distance with the maximum aperture, many of these lenses will make you some really quite considerable blur in the background of a shot, and there's been quite a few occasions where I've had to stop down, maybe 2 or 3 stops, so that the background isn't too blurry, not all the detail is wiped out. I don't think that's a good look personally. And also to get the subject in shot. The plane of focus at short distances like that is very, very thin, so you need to increase it a little bit by stopping down to get all of your subject in focus and not just a little bit of it. So I've got 5 of these lenses to show you today, and I'll tell you what they are. They are, where's my glasses? Can't see without my glasses. They are the Canon FD 28mm, the Vivitar F2 28mm, that's a very interesting lens, the Meyer Optik Lidith 30mm f3.5, that's a nice little bubbly lens. You can make bubbles with this if you get close enough. We've got the Olympus Zuiko 35 f2.8, and finally we also have this lens. This is the Carl Zeiss Jena Flektogon 35mm f2.4. I've had this lens many years and it just grows on me. It's not the sharpest lens absolutely out there, but it's just a beautiful lens. It keeps growing and growing on me, so I'm going to keep hold of this one. So those are today's 5 lenses. So without further ado, let's check them out. All right, so today's first lens is this little beauty. This is the Canon FD 28mm f2.8. Now, prices of these Canon FD lenses have been rising recently. There was a time not so long ago when they were in the doldrums and they weren't really as valuable or as highly priced as many other vintage lenses. I think there were two reasons for that. I think partly it's because there's a certain amount of plastic used in their construction. The aperture ring, I don't know, is that plastic? I think the focus ring is metal, but nevertheless there are bits of plastic components used in these lenses. It doesn't seem to trouble them, but I think that may be why they were undervalued for a while. They're actually very light, so that's a really good thing. And I think something else that perhaps made them less valuable was the fact that they render in a slightly more modern way than many of their vintage counterparts and brethren. So for those two reasons, I think maybe these Canon FDs floundered for a little bit, but now now prices are on the rise, and that is because they have very, very beautiful optics. They're really second to none. These were the later generation of Canon lenses. It was the last generation of lenses before they went autofocus, so they're pretty modern. And they make very, very nice images. The rendering has a modern-ish feel, and they're just very, very beautiful lenses. Let's have a closer look at this one. So here's the lens in a closer view, and you can see there those beautiful Canon coatings reflecting in the light, those blue-purple coatings, and they go a long way towards giving this lens its beautiful image quality and giving colour to the flares that come out of this lens, because you do get some nice flares from it. There's the body of the lens with the usual white and green Canon markings, and there's the rear with the Canon FD mount, which can be a little fiddly to connect to a mirrorless camera. You have to hook a pin over this lever here, so they can be a little awkward to mount, and that possibly is another reason why they haven't been particularly highly priced in the past. But it's a very, very nice optic. In size, it's actually a little bigger than most 28s I've used, but it's not too big, and it's still a nice small-ish lens. Very, very nice little optic indeed. Now, I love these Canon lenses because they work really, really well. They've got fantastic optics inside them, and that, after all, is the key to success with any lens. It doesn't matter too much what the body's made of, what it looks like, how it's constructed, as long as those optics are nice, and in this one they certainly are. This is a very sharp lens. It's a lens you can shoot all day wide open and have no problems whatsoever. You'll get very sharp images out of it wide open. It will get a little sharper if you stop it down, but I think the main advantage of stopping a wide like this down, say to f8 or even f11, is that it turns your camera into something resembling a point and shoot camera if you're on the street. It means that you get massive depth of field. So set to f8 or even further to f11, set your focus to 2 meters or thereabouts, and you've got huge depth of field. You've got a very, very large plane of focus, so you don't need to think about shooting, or rather focusing on the street. You can just shoot from the hip, use your camera like a point and shoot, and that is really the only time I'll stop a wide lens down. Actually, I tell a lie. The other time I'll stop a wide lens down is if I'm very close to the subject, if it goes close to the subject and I want to get more of that subject in focus, then I'll stop down as well. So this is a very, very sharp lens. It gives very beautiful colours. The colours that come out of these Canon lenses are really something. They're nice and pumped up and saturated, which is just how I personally like them. You can go too saturated, of course, but you can go too undersaturated. And for me, if you're going to shoot in colour, let's have plenty of it. And this lens will certainly deliver that. The minimum focus distance is 30 centimeters on this one, so it can get down nice and close to your subject and give you a little bit of blur if that's what you're looking for. Blur has a nice quality. It's softer and more reliably soft than many vintage lenses. This lens does render in a bit more of a modern way than many of its vintage counterparts, and so you can be reasonably certain that your blur isn't going to turn rough or harsh at any point, and it's going to be nice and smooth, just like the smooth blur coming out of modern lenses. Perhaps not just like, it's not quite as sophisticated, and it does retain some quirks and flaws to give it character, but generally speaking, blur from these Canon FD lenses is rather more reliably smooth than many of its vintage counterparts. As for prices, I did say these have been going up recently, and they have. I wouldn't pay any more than £50 for one of these, £60 at the outside. That would be a buy it now price. Auction prices tend to be lower, so I would say go for an auction every time and try not to spend more than £40 on one of these. You shouldn't have to. You should be able to get a nice one for around about that price. And at that price, I reckon this lens is a bargain. If you grab one now before they get too expensive, you won't regret it. This one's a real beauty. Okay, lens number 2 today was a recent acquisition, and it's this one. This is the Vivitar 28mm f2, and I was very surprised actually when I bought this lens. When I bought it, I looked at it and I saw that it was an f2.8, but actually when I looked closer after I'd bought it, I was very pleased to discover that I'd actually bought an f2 28mm lens, and that is a really interesting thing. 28mm wide lenses don't tend to appear too often with such a fast aperture speed, so I was very pleased to get this one. It's a very nicely made lens. It's all metal. It's got a nice big front element there. There are 2 versions of this lens, and apparently this is the slightly less good one. And when I shot this lens, I don't know, I was a little bit underwhelmed, but I've been kind of reviewing the images that it made, and I think perhaps I've been a little bit harsh on it. I think perhaps this little Vivitar is rather better than I initially thought. Let's look at it more closely. All right, here's the little Vivitar, and it's a beautiful little thing. It's got nice sort of greeny blue coatings on the elements there, a little bit of a purple tint coming off there. This one's in very nice condition, and it's a very nicely made lens. It's all metal. I can't feel any plastic on this lens's construction, apart from the aperture ring, which seems to be a plastic one, but everything else I'm pretty sure, let's have some focus, everything else I'm pretty sure is metal. So this is a nicely made lens. I don't know who made it, whether it was Vivitar themselves or another company. Various companies made various lenses for various other companies, so you never can quite tell. But it's a beautiful little thing. This one's in K-mount version. Please, let's have some focus. This one's in K-mount version, and it's a very, very nicely made little lens indeed. Now this lens will go down to 30 centimeters, or just a little bit beyond that. That's its minimum focus distance. So at that minimum focus distance, with the aperture as wide as it will go to f2, it's going to make you plenty of blur. The blur itself can be a little bit tricky. It can turn a little bit harsh, a little bit nervous, and it can be a little bit rough, but you can shoot around that. That's one thing we can do, is shoot around any rough patches in blur, and we can use those rough patches in blur as well to get the quirks and the effects in our shots that we want. And this lens, in that sense, has quite a varied personality. It can, at some distances, some combinations of distance between camera, subject and background, it can give you very nice smooth blur. So when it happens, it's really lovely. Stop it down just a little bit and it becomes very sharp. I found it to be just slightly soft, sometimes wide open, but stop it down and it becomes very, very sharp indeed. To f2.8 even will do. That will bring a little bit of snappiness and a bit of perkiness to these images, but they're not particularly soft anyway, so that's not really a problem. Colour is nice from this lens. We've got purple and green coatings on there, so we've got some pretty nice colour coming through. It does lose contrast in the sunlight, but you know what, that's true of pretty much all vintage lenses and many modern ones as well. There are very few lenses that can do battle with that mighty star and come out the winner. So yeah, it'll lose contrast in strong sunlight if you catch the sun at the wrong angle. Usual solution, shade it with your hand like that, or use a hood or whatever you can do to just protect the surface of that lens from those rays, and your contrast will come back. A very nice little lens and a very unusual little lens. Wide angle lenses with fast apertures are not common, so this is a nice one. These lenses tend to sell for around £60 or so, but as I've always said, the bargains are out there. I picked this one up for £15 from a charity shop, what's called a thrift shop in the USA, I believe. And so the bargains are still out there. Don't give up on the bargains despite the recent increase in prices. Millions of vintage lenses were made and there's still millions that haven't surfaced. So keep on checking those cheapy shops and you will find the bargains. Usually found for around 60-ish pounds or thereabouts, and a good lens at that price. Very nice little wide angle. Okay, next on our odyssey of lenses is this lovely little beauty, and it is a little lens, a very small, compact little thing. It's from the old East Germany, the former East Germany, and it's from Meyer Optik Görlitz. It's the Lidith 3.5, f3.5 30mm. And there were so many of these lenses made. There are millions and millions and millions made. This one's in Exacta mount, but Exacta bayonet mount, because Exacta mount lenses are that little bit cheaper. And they're just as easy to adapt to mirrorless. That is if you're not shooting on film. So these are great little lenses, and this little lens's main claim to fame is the kind of background blur it can make up close. Now it gets down to a fairly reasonable close distance of 33 centimeters. It's not very fast as f3.5, but its party trick is the blur it makes close up. You can squeeze some bubbles out of this lens, as you can with a lot of the Meyer Optik lenses, but it's also a great walk around lens as well. Let's have a closer look at this one. So here's the little Lidith in close-up, and you can see its front plate there. You can also see that this one has had a little bit of a knock sometime there on the edge. Somebody's straightened the edge out there, but that's all right. It still works nicely. It's got these two rings here. The aperture ring is at the front, and that's stepless, so it might be a good lens for any videographers out there. And the focus ring is at the back. That turns nicely and smoothly. They're not terribly easy to tell apart with the camera to your eye, so you do have to, I found I did have to keep taking the camera away from my eye to see which was aperture and which was focus. So that's a minor gripe about the lens, but it is only a minor gripe. It's all metal, as most of the older lenses were, and it's a very nice little optic indeed. Now, I may have miscounted, but looking down the barrel, I think I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I can see 7 aperture blades in there, but more importantly, what I can see in there is that the aperture blades form a circle at pretty much all apertures. So that is where we get the soap bubble blur from, and this lens can do it. It's not as easy to prompt it to do it as it is with some of the Meyer Optic lenses. They were very famous for it, a lot of them. The Trio Plan, for example, is really famous for the soap bubble lens, soap bubble blur it gives. This one can do it, but you really do have to coax it out of it. But when you do, it gives you nice results. It's fairly sharp wide open, partly because it's an f3.5. It doesn't open very far. It's not a fast lens, so it does have some good inherent sharpness, and it will focus down to 33 centimeters, as I say, to give you some blur at those close distances, maybe out to, I don't know, 50 to 80 centimeters or so. You're going to get some blur in the back of your shot, so that's nice. A very, very nice little lens with good color rendering, good sharpness, a nice quality of blur that you will have to work to squeeze out of it, but it can give it relatively easily. So a great little optic. As for prices, well, buy it now, as I've seen them 50, 60, even 70 pounds. I don't think they're worth that. There were many, many millions of them made, and they're not the world's finest optic. They're certainly not the world's worst optic. They're a very nice lens, but they're not the very, very finest of the fine. So certainly don't pay more than £50 for this lens. Try to buy one on an auction rather than a buy it now if you can, because those usually tend to be cheaper. But I wouldn't be paying too much for this lens, certainly not more than £50. But if you can grab one for that or less, well, it's a very nice little optic. It will be cheaper if you buy one in exact amount, so search for exact amount and get yourself an adapter for your camera. Exact amount lenses are generally cheaper. A lovely little optic, and one I've enjoyed playing with very much. Now here's a lens that is a particular favourite of mine. This is the Carl Zeiss Jena f2.4 35mm Flectagon, and this is really a beautiful old lens. This is a lens I've owned for many, many years, and I've used it for just everything. General photography, product photography, close-ups. It goes very close, down to I think 20 centimeters or maybe even less. Yeah, it goes down to about 19 or so centimeters. So this lens shoots pretty close, and it can make some nice background blur up close. But before we talk about any of that, let's have a closer look. So there's the Carl Zeiss Jena Flectagon. This is the later multi-coated version. I think it also says electric on it somewhere, does it? I don't know. Some of these later CZJ lenses do. I don't think this one does. This is a beautiful old lens. It's all metal. Everything is nice condition still. The focus ring turns really smoothly and nicely. It's a bit of an extender. It does extend a little as you go towards minimum focus distance, and it retracts towards infinity. The aperture ring is at the back on these lenses. There are half stops on this lens, so that's nice. You can get a nice accurate aperture setting with this lens. It's an M42 mount, as far as I know. Most of them were M42. There are some exacta mount versions. They'll probably be a little cheaper, but most of them that you'll find are M42. A beautiful lens with very, very nice optics. So this Flectagon then is one of the nicest vintage wides you can buy. It's pretty sharp, wide open. It is beaten by some other wide lenses in sharpness. It's not the sharpest vintage 35 you can buy, but it's a very sharp vintage 35 wide open. It goes very close to its subject if you want to do that, and I've made some really nice close-ups with this lens. It's really good for close-up shots. It's not a macro lens, but it does go very close, and you can make some really interesting close-up shots with it. If you stop it down a little, it becomes very sharp indeed. In fact, shooting very close to your subject, you'll need to stop down a little to enlarge that plane of focus, because it really is very small at the minimum focus distance and wide open, so you'll probably need to stop down. So it does become very sharp when you stop it down. Colour is very lovely from this lens. It gives fantastic colour representation, and in fact that is something the Carl Zeiss Jena lenses are really good at. They give very beautiful colour. So generally a very beautiful lens, very beautiful colour representation, nice and sharp wide open, but gets bitingly sharp if you stop down. A very short minimum focus distance and really lovely blur. This is generally reliable and consistent blur from this lens, and it doesn't tend to have many, if any, harsh spots throughout its range of focus. Blur from this one is consistently nice throughout the range. It has enough quirks to give it character, but that character is just beautiful. It's soft in the background, it's sharp in the subject, the colours are just lovely, and it just has a lovely feel to it. It's one of the nicest feeling lenses that I've shot in many years. I've had this lens many years, and I've kept it because it's so nice. These are not the cheapest vintage lenses. They will cost you, a good one will cost you around about £150. There is a slower version, an f2.8 version, but it's not quite as nice. What you really want, if you want one of these, what you really want is the f2.4 version, and those will cost you around about £150. That's not the cheapest vintage lens, but as lens prices go, lenses in general, that's a very cheap lens. And the quality is really just something else. These CZJ lenses, the late CZJ lenses, even the early ones, are really something. And this is at £150, fantastic value. And if you buy one, I don't think you'll be disappointed. All right, finally today I have this beautiful little Olympus 35mm f2.8, and when I say little, it really is a small lens, this one. I do love these Olympus lenses. This one is a really nice one. It's the Auto W. There are various naming systems. So this one's from mid-production. It's got the serial number here, so you know when you see a lens with a serial number on the front plate there, one of these Zuiko lenses with the number on the front, you know this is middle production from around about 1980, maybe 78 to 80, something like that. So it's not one of the last lenses, it's one of the middle from the production run. This is a great little lens, but before we discuss it, I'll show it you close up in a little more detail. So there's our little Olympus lens, and these are really good looking lenses, and I don't know if you feel the same, but I find that the look of a lens is actually quite important and affects how I can relate and bond with that lens. It helps me like a lens more if I like the look. I like the green markings that they have together with the orange markings. I think that works really well. And I love this aluminium or steel or whatever metal it is band around the edge there. So these are great looking lenses apart from anything else. There's the Olympus bayonet mount at the back. And you can see, I think, how small this lens is. It really is a tiny little thing, and these Zuikos generally are very small. It does extend a bit, but not very much. The focus throw is pretty small on this one. How far is that? That's not even 180 degrees. That's about 150 degrees, something like that. So it's a nice short focus throw. The front element is a little exposed, so it's probably going to catch some rays there and drop contrast if you're not careful. But a lovely little lens, very jewel-like in their construction, very nice to hold, to handle and to use. So this is a beautiful little lens. It's a lovely optic that I've used for quite some time now. It's very, very sharp, wide open, and generally the Olympus OM Zuiko lenses are known for that. Many of them are just that little bit sharper than some of their competitors, and this one is no exception. You can shoot it wide open all day at f2.8 or stop it down to get biting sharpness when you want real sharpness in a shot, or for increased depth of field if you want to turn your camera into a point and shoot or something resembling one. It's got very nice blur. It goes down to 30 centimeters, so it can make some blur at its minimum focus distance and with the aperture wide open. And the blur is of a generally nice quality. It's very soft, it's very lovely, but at 1 or 2 points it can turn a little bit rough and a little bit harsh, and the Zuiko lenses can do that. It's easy to shoot around and it's not really awful. It's not like it makes your shot really rough or horrible, but it just has those quirks and flaws that mean sometimes the blur will turn a little bit harsh depending on the changing conditions, changing distances between your camera, your subject and your background. Generally blur is lovely from this one. But if you compare it, for example, to the CZJ Flectagon we just looked at, that has more reliably smooth blur. This one can have 1 or 2 rough patches, although it's generally very nice. So it's sharp, it's got lovely blur. The colour from this lens really is nice. It's saturated, it's pumped up. I do like my colours saturated, as I've said. I think you can go too high in saturation, but you can also go too low in saturation. And I do think a shot in colour, for me anyway, for my taste, needs to pop just a little bit and have some of that saturation. And this one can deliver it. Really nice colours with a proper amount of pop. If you get a silver nose version of this lens, the early nose Olympus lenses, the early versions of the Olympus lenses had a silver ring around the nose here, and they're called silver nose. So if you get one of those, the colour will be slightly different. They do have slightly different colour representation because they were single coated, not multi-coated. So they have a little bit of a chromy look, and they're a little more prone to getting washed out by reflections from the sun. This one will get washed out, as all vintage lenses do, but early silver nose versions are a little bit more prone. As always, shield it with your hand or a hood, or anything that comes to hand. So good colour, good sharpness, nice blur, also very nice contrast from this lens, and good micro contrast as well. Olympus lenses, OM lenses are known for that. They usually do give good contrast, and they're very resistant to washing out in the sunlight, although of course that can happen. If you catch the light at the wrong angle, it will certainly wash out. But this one has a fairly good resistance to it, and it doesn't do it too easily. When it does catch the sun, you can sometimes make some very nice flares with these Zuiko lenses. If you like flares, I know they're not everybody's cup of tea, but I personally rather like them. So a beautiful little optic, and when I say little, just look at the size of this thing. It's really small, very, very tiny little lens indeed, and although it extends as you focus, it still remains small. Pop one of these on an OM camera, a film camera, and you've got a very tiny rig. Put one on a digital mirrorless camera, the adapter's going to be about so long, about there. Even then, the rig is still nicely balanced and, you know, nice to hold and nice to carry, so it's a win all round with the size for this lens. Very, very small optic indeed. If you want to buy one of these, well, like all vintage lenses, they've gone up a little bit, or even rather a lot. But you can buy a good one of these. You can find a nice one of these for around about 50 to 60 pounds. That would be a buy it now price. I wouldn't pay any more than 60 pounds on buy it now. On an auction, you'll probably get one for around 40 pounds. So somewhere between 40 to 60 pounds, I think, is a fair price for one of these lenses. Grab one for that price and you won't go wrong and you won't regret it. So a very, very nice little optic. So there we are, 5 beautiful little lenses in our lineup today. And all of them will make you very nice images. They've all got little quirks and flaws that distinguish them from each other and give them an identity and make them really interesting lenses, and lenses that will give an image that's far more interesting than that you would get from a modern lens. Plenty of character in every one of these little wide angles. So there we are, that's it from me for this week. I do hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. I hope it's been interesting and worthwhile. Thank you for watching, and thank you to subscribers. I really do appreciate your support. If you've watched this episode and you've enjoyed it, maybe chuck us a sub, that would be appreciated. Thank you also to patrons, without whose support this show couldn't be made in the way that it is. So many, many thanks to patrons also. And thank you to you for watching. If you'd like to support this channel, you can do that over at patreon.com/Zenography, and you can do that from $1 a week. And if you think that this old hippie's doing a reasonable job of keeping the old lenses and the old gear alive, please consider doing that. That would be appreciated too. As from me, that's it for this time. Many, many thanks for watching, and if you're not doing anything too irritating, irksome or difficult next week around this time, please do join me for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.